The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you forget the chaos of the world. The stars were out, and the neighborhood was still. That was until the flashing red and blue lights shattered the darkness. I stepped outside, my heart pounding, and there she was, Margaret, the HOA president, standing smugly beside the cops, arms crossed, lips curled in victory. Margaret had tried everything. Petty fines, bogus complaints, even sneaking onto my property. But when I wouldn't bow to her ridiculous HOA rules, she played her final card. She called the police. Margaret thought this was checkmate. She thought she was about to watch me get dragged off my own property. She had no idea the officer stepping out of that cruiser was my son. And what happened next wouldn't just end her little power trip, it would end the entire HOA. When I bought this house, I thought I was escaping the nonsense of apartment living. No noisy neighbors, no property managers micromanaging my life, and best of all, no HOA. At least, that's what I thought. Then I met Margaret. Margaret was the kind of woman who carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. She had a short blonde bob, crisp business attire even in the sweltering heat, and a permanent scowl that could freeze water. She stood across the street, watching me like I had just committed a crime. I gave her a polite nod. She didn't return it. Instead, she turned and walked away, as if I had already failed some unwritten test. That was my first warning. The second came before I even unpacked. A bright red paper was taped to my front door. HOA violation, immediate action required. I hadn't even moved in for a full day. I ripped it off and read the fine print. Violation 1, grass above regulation length. Violation 2, trash cans visible from the street. Violation 3, my truck, an oversized commercial vehicle. I let out a dry chuckle. This had to be a joke. I wasn't part of an HOA. There was no mention of it in my closing documents, no contract I had ever signed. This was nothing more than a power trip. That evening, as I was unloading boxes, I heard the sharp click of heels on pavement. I turned to see Margaret marching toward me, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other. Her smile was tight, like she'd been waiting all day for this. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice dripping with faux politeness. "You need to remove that vehicle immediately." I set down the box and wiped my brow. "I'm sorry, what?" Margaret gestured at my truck. "Oversized vehicles are not permitted in this community. It's against HOA regulations." I raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, that's not happening." Her lips twitched, as if she wasn't used to being told no. "I don't think you understand. Your house falls under our jurisdiction. The board voted last year to annex your street into the HOA." I chuckled. "You can't just vote people into an HOA." Margaret's smirk widened. "We already have." I took a step closer, my voice steady. "I never signed anything. I don't owe you or your board a damn thing." Her face tightened. "You will comply," she snapped. "If you refuse, we will escalate." I tilted my head. "To who?" She lifted her chin. "The authorities." I stared at her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Go ahead." Margaret's eye twitched. She had expected resistance, not defiance. She turned on her heel and stormed off. An hour later, 3 more violation notices were taped to my fence. The next day, my mailbox was stuffed with HOA warnings. And the day after that, a $250 fine for noncompliance. I laughed, tossing it straight in the trash. But that night, my security cameras caught something interesting. Margaret, flashlight in hand, taking pictures of my truck. She wasn't just harassing me. She was building a case. And that's when I knew this wasn't over. The fines, the threats, the trespassing, that was just her warm-up round. Because Margaret was about to raise the stakes. And when she did, she wouldn't just lose her power, she'd lose everything. The next morning, I woke up to another violation notice taped to my door. Failure to maintain aesthetic compliance. I rolled my eyes. Aesthetic compliance? What did that even mean? I scanned the fine print. My front door was the wrong shade of brown. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. I ignored it. Big mistake. That afternoon, while fixing my backyard fence, I heard voices out front. When I stepped onto my driveway, I saw them, 2 HOA board members. One, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, was measuring my grass with a ruler. The other, a woman in her 50s, was scribbling in a notepad like she was collecting evidence. I folded my arms. "Can I help you?" Wire-rimmed glasses didn't even look up. "Just conducting an inspection. You're already facing multiple violations." I let out a short laugh. I never signed up for your HOA. You have no authority here. The woman scoffed. That's not how this works. She jotted something down. If you refuse to comply, the board will have no choice but to take legal action. I stepped closer, dropping my voice. You think I'm scared of your fake little fines? They didn't answer. Instead, they turned and walked off like they had already won. I had had enough. That night, I installed security cameras on every corner of my house. If Margaret and her cronies wanted to play dirty, I was going to document every second of it. And just in time. Because the next morning, I woke up to find my truck vandalized. Deep scratches, slashed tires, a shattered side mirror. I checked the security footage, already knowing who I'd find. And sure enough, there she was, Margaret, in the middle of the night, walking up to my driveway with a can of spray paint in her hand. My blood boiled. This wasn't just HOA nonsense anymore. This was criminal. I printed the photos, got in my car, and drove straight to the county office. I asked to speak with someone about the HOA's authority. The clerk pulled up a file and frowned. Wait, this HOA isn't even registered to govern your street. I blinked. Come again. She turned the screen toward me. Margaret's HOA had never legally annexed my property. All those fines, the violation notices, completely illegitimate. I grinned. Oh, this was going to be fun. That afternoon, I marched straight to Margaret's house. She opened the door with that same smug expression until she saw the papers in my hand. You have no legal authority over my property, I said, tossing the documents onto her front porch. Your HOA is a joke. Her face turned red. You think this is over? She hissed. I smirked. I know it is. I turned and walked away, thinking I had finally won. I was wrong. Because later that night, I heard sirens. And the cops were at my door. This wasn't just about a few fines. Because Margaret had just crossed a serious line. And now, I was about to turn the tables. I opened the door to find two officers standing on my porch, hands resting on their belts. Behind them, standing just far enough to avoid looking guilty, was Margaret, arms crossed, chin lifted, looking way too satisfied with herself. The taller officer cleared his throat. Sir, we received a complaint about a disturbance at this residence. I arched an eyebrow. A disturbance? Margaret stepped forward before I could say another word. This man has been threatening me and repeatedly violating community regulations, she announced, her voice dripping with fake authority. He's aggressive and refuses to comply with HOA laws. He's making this neighborhood unsafe. I almost laughed. Unsafe? The only thing unsafe around here was Margaret's grip on reality. I turned to the officers. Do you have any actual evidence of this so-called aggression? The shorter officer checked his notepad. We were told there were multiple complaints from neighbors about your behavior. Margaret's smirk deepened. She really thought this was going to work. I folded my arms. That's funny, because I have actual evidence of harassment. I stepped back inside, grabbed my laptop, and pulled up my security footage. And there she was, Margaret, sneaking onto my property at night, taking pictures of my truck, scrutinizing my yard like a predator circling prey. And then the best part, the footage of her vandalizing my vehicle. I turned the screen toward the officers. Now tell me, officers, does this look like a law-abiding citizen to you? Margaret's face drained of color. The taller officer's expression hardened. Ma'am, is this your voice on the recording? Margaret stammered, her confidence cracking like glass. That video is edited. He's trying to frame me. I let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. Margaret, it's a live security feed. Timestamped. With motion detection logs. One officer glanced at the other, then nodded. Sir, would you like to press charges for trespassing and property damage? Margaret gasped, her entire demeanor shifting from smug to panicked in an instant. Wait, no? You can't take his side. He's the problem. I shrugged. I think the evidence speaks for itself. The officer stepped aside to talk privately for a moment while Margaret stood there, gripping her clipboard like it was a life raft. She shot me a murderous glare, but I could see the realization sinking in. She wasn't in control anymore. The officers turned back to us. The taller one said, Sir, we'll be filing a report. And Miss Margaret, we strongly advise you to stop engaging with this resident. Margaret's jaw tightened. She looked like she was about to burst. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. She pointed a trembling finger at me. You'll regret this, she whispered. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I grinned. Neither do you. She stormed off, her heels clicking violently against the pavement. I watched her go, thinking she'd finally gotten the message. But I had underestimated her arrogance. Because less than 24 hours later, she called 911. And this time, she wasn't just filing a complaint, she was trying to get me arrested. Margaret had lost this battle, but she wasn't done playing her game. And her next move would be her biggest mistake yet. I was in my garage, minding my business, when I heard it, screaming. I stepped outside and found Margaret standing in the middle of my lawn, phone pressed to her ear, voice frantic. "Yes, he's right in front of me now," she shrieked. "He's threatening me. He refuses to leave my property. I'm scared for my life. Please send someone now." I stared at her, stunned. "My property?" That's when she turned to me, her fake fear melting into a smug little smile. She wasn't just lying. She was setting me up. And just like that, I heard the sirens. Margaret thought she had outplayed me. She thought she had the cops on her side. But the officer stepping out of that car was my son, the chief of police. And when she realized who he was, all the color drained from her face. Within minutes, Margaret was arrested for filing a false police report, trespassing, and vandalism. But it didn't end there. My son's investigation uncovered embezzlement, illegal annexation, and fraud within the HOA. The board was dissolved, and homeowners got their money back. As for me, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, watching the neighborhood finally enjoy its freedom. Margaret had wanted me gone. Instead, she lost everything. Or so I thought. Because a month later, I got a letter from the new HOA president. And that letter changed everything. Because just when I thought it was over, it wasn't. I sat on my porch, sipping my morning coffee, the steam rising into the crisp autumn air. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, even. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The HOA was gone, Margaret was facing criminal charges, and the homeowners had finally gotten their money back. It was over. Or so I thought. That's when I saw it. A crisp, white envelope sticking out of my mailbox. I frowned. I wasn't expecting any mail. I set my coffee down and walked over, pulling the envelope out. It was addressed to me, but there was no return address. I opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Dear Mr. Carter, congratulations on your victory. You've done what no one else in this neighborhood had the courage to do. You took down Margaret and dismantled the HOA. But let me ask you this, what now? Do you really think this neighborhood can function without rules? Without order? Without leadership? I am the new HOA president, elected by a majority of homeowners who believe in the importance of maintaining our community standards. We've learned from Margaret's mistakes, and we're committed to transparency, fairness, and accountability. But we can't do it without your cooperation. Consider this your official notice. Your property is now under the jurisdiction of the newly reformed HOA. We expect your full compliance with all regulations moving forward. Sincerely, Evelyn Harper, President, Maplewood Estates HOA. I stared at the letter, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Not again. I had fought so hard to free myself and the entire neighborhood from the clutches of the HOA. And now, just when I thought it was over, they were back. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my phone and called my son, Daniel, the chief of police. He answered on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay?" "Daniel, we've got a problem," I said, my voice tight. "The HOA's back. They've elected a new president, and they're trying to pull the same crap Margaret did." There was a pause on the other end. "What? How is that even possible?" "The HOA was dissolved. There's no legal framework for them to operate." "I don't know, but they've sent me a letter claiming my property is under their jurisdiction again. They're calling themselves the new and improved HOA." Daniel sighed. "All right, let me look into it. In the meantime, don't engage with them. If they try anything, call me immediately." I hung up, my mind racing. Who was this Evelyn Harper? And how had she managed to resurrect the HOA so quickly? I needed answers. The next day, I received another letter, this time, an invitation to a neighborhood meeting at the community center. The subject, the future of Maplewood Estates. I knew I had to go. If this new HOA thought they could just waltz in and take over, they had another thing coming. The community center was packed when I arrived. Neighbors I hadn't seen in months were there, murmuring amongst themselves. At the front of the room stood a woman I didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. This had to be Evelyn Harper. She cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. Thank you all for coming. I know the past few months have been tumultuous, but today marks a new beginning for Maplewood Estates. Together, we can rebuild this community into something we can all be proud of. I couldn't stay quiet any longer. Rebuild, I called out, standing up. The HOA was a disaster. It was corrupt, oppressive, and downright criminal. And now you're trying to bring it back. Evelyn turned to me, her expression calm but firm. Mr. Carter, I understand your concerns. But the truth is, this neighborhood needs rules. Without them, property values will plummet, and chaos will take over. We've learned from the mistakes of the past. This new HOA will be different. Different how? I shot back. Margaret said the same thing, and look where that got us. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Margaret was a rogue actor. She abused her power, and she's paying the price for it. But that doesn't mean the concept of an HOA is flawed. It just means we need better leadership. The room erupted into murmurs. Some people nodded in agreement, while others looked skeptical. I could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't going to be easy. A week later, I received another notice from the HOA. This time, it was a warning about my fence. Apparently, it was out of compliance with the new HOA regulations. I rolled my eyes and tossed it in the trash. I wasn't going to play their game. But Evelyn wasn't going to let it go. The next day, I came home to find her standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand. Mr. Carter, she said, her tone polite but firm. I noticed you haven't addressed the issue with your fence. I crossed my arms. That's because there is no issue. My fence is fine. It's 6 inches taller than the regulation height, she replied. I'm afraid you'll need to either lower it or remove it entirely. I stared at her, incredulous. You've got to be kidding me. This is exactly the kind of nonsense Margaret pulled. I'm not doing a damn thing. Evelyn's expression hardened. Mr. Carter, I'm trying to be reasonable here. But if you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to take action. What kind of action? I challenged. Fines, she said simply. And if necessary, legal action. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Bring it on. That night, I called Daniel again. They're at it again, I said. This new HOA president, Evelyn Harper, is just as bad as Margaret. She's already threatening me with fines and legal action. Daniel sighed. Dad, I've been looking into this. The new HOA is complicated. They've managed to get enough homeowners to sign on, and they've filed the necessary paperwork with the county. Legally, they're operating within their rights. What? I exclaimed. How is that possible? They framed it as a reform effort, Daniel explained. They've promised transparency and accountability, and enough people bought into it to make it official. I clenched my fists. So what am I supposed to do? Just roll over and let them take over? No, Daniel said firmly. But you need to be smart about this. If they're operating within the law, you can't just ignore them. You need to fight them on their own terms. I decided to take Daniel's advice. If Evelyn and her new HOA wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But this time, I wouldn't do it alone. I reached out to other homeowners who had been burned by the old HOA. Together, we formed a resistance, a group of neighbors committed to keeping the HOA in check. We started by attending every HOA meeting, challenging every decision, and demanding transparency. Evelyn tried to maintain control, but it was clear she wasn't used to being questioned. The more we pushed, the more her facade of calm authority began to crack. Then, we found it, the smoking gun. One of our members, a retired accountant, dug through the HOA's financial records and discovered discrepancies. Money was missing, and it wasn't hard to figure out where it was going. Evelyn had been embezzling funds, just like Margaret. We presented the evidence at the next HOA meeting. The room erupted into chaos. Evelyn tried to deny it, but the proof was undeniable. Within days, she was forced to resign, and the new HOA was once again dissolved. As I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The neighborhood was free again, but for how long? The fight against the HOA had taught me one thing: power corrupts, and there will always be someone willing to abuse it. But I also knew this: as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight, the HOA would never win. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.